Hi, it's Emma. I hope you enjoyed that little snippet of my trip to California. I was there recently and I just wanted to show that little snippet at the start of this video. Today I just kind of wanted to introduce myself as a writer. That's something that I haven't done on this channel or in my social media yet, and I thought it might be interesting for you to learn a little bit about like where I've been as a writer and where I'm going, including my novel project that I'm calling Project Hopepunk. But let's start with where I started with writing. I learned to read pretty early on and I loved it. I just devoured stories and books and anything I could get my hands on. And then I was fortunate enough to go to a school where creative writing was really emphasized from the start. Even in first grade, I remember those little pieces of paper with the space for drawing at the top and then the little lines for your story. And I wrote funny little stories that I thought my classmates would like. And I just really fell in love with stories and my own potential to create them. At the beginning, I learned the way that a lot of writers do, by reading a lot and reading my favorite stories and consciously or subconsciously trying to emulate them. I remember reading a story about a young girl who travels through a mirror to another world, and I wanted to write something like that. And so I wrote it and I printed out copies of it, and I gave one to my writing teacher. And I remember feeling really proud when she kept it in her classroom as a story for the younger students to read. It felt like a big accomplishment at the time, and it really encouraged me. I was about 12 when I started trying to write novels. I had a best friend at the time who was into writing as well, and we collaborated on a sort of like an urban fantasy story about two girls with magic, and each of us wrote from one of the girls' points of view. I remember it being really fun just to work with her, and then I was working on my own project, a fantasy world with dragons and battles and all sorts of fun stuff. I don't have any of these stories anymore. They were on my family's desktop computer in the early 2000s. I was a kid, so they weren't like technically good, but they were good practice for me, and I had a lot of fun writing them. I was about 13 or 14 when I sort of left the fantasy genre and started writing more realistic fiction. That's what I was reading by that point. I was interested in more of the romance narratives, and so I started writing about a love square where it's two hetero couples who sort of by the end have traded partners. I didn't know I was queer yet, otherwise that story could have been maybe a little more fun and a little less predictable. But I was really focusing on the sentence level writing, the descriptions of characters and settings, and really just having a lot of fun with that. Later, when I was more like 15, I started writing a lot more poetry than fiction. I was struggling a lot with bullying and with like mental health, and I was just having a really hard time, and so poetry was a way for me to express some of those feelings in a private way. I started writing about some experiences with a boyfriend that I had had. It was like a novel in verse. That's what I was working on around that time. My parents could really tell that I was struggling, and so eventually they pulled me out of the school that I was in, where I was having a lot of issues with the bullying and stuff, and put me into a private arts high school. I remember visiting that school and just feeling so inspired by all the work that the other kids were doing, and I just was really excited by the potential to go there. At my arts high school, creative writing wasn't a subject that you could only take once. It was a subject that you could take every semester as your elective if you wanted to, and it would focus on different topics each time. And so that was really good for me to just be able to focus on what I loved so deeply. I had a teacher who I really loved. She gave a lot of great feedback and really encouraged me in my poetry and my short story writing. I started reading books about writing, stuff like Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird or Natalie Goldberg's Writing Down the Bones. I was just really absorbed into this art and really soaking up that creative energy. I had wanted to be an author since that first creative writing class when I was 6 years old. But towards the end of high school, I got kind of discouraged by that idea. People would ask questions that basically boiled down to like, oh, that's so cool, you love writing. What are you going to do to make money? Are you going to be a teacher? Are you going to be a professor? Are you going to, do something different entirely? So I kind of felt like I had to pick something else because I couldn't sustain myself with writing. I came up with all these different possible careers. A lot of them were based on books I was reading. The character had an interesting job and I would think, oh, maybe I could do that. But eventually I learned what a hospital chaplain is, and I got really interested in doing that. For anyone who doesn't know, a hospital chaplain is someone who can come into a patient's room if they're struggling with health diagnoses or if they're potentially looking at end of life, and just help them, sometimes involving religion, like doing last rites and things like that, and sometimes just involving comfort. I was really interested in religion, and so that was something that appealed to me about chaplaincy, and I really wanted to help people just in a very direct way, and so I thought chaplaincy would be really great for that. So in college, I majored in religious studies, but I did minor in English, and I took as many creative writing classes as I could. I had a great professor who really broke down the component parts of a story in a way that no teacher had ever really done before. And I thought that was really interesting and really helpful. My classes mostly focused on short stories, and I wrote a couple that I'm still really proud of. Because of my schoolwork, I was really only writing when I had an assignment, when I was in a class that required it. And even then, a lot of the time I struggled to get it done. Around the middle of college, my health started declining. I didn't know that's what was happening. I thought it was a combination of like depression and insomnia, and my doctors agreed. And so I really had to fight through the rest of college. I graduated by the skin of my teeth. It was really hard. Honestly, it was a really hard time in my life. After graduation, I took a year off from school. My boyfriend at the time, my husband now, and I traveled to New Zealand, which was an amazing experience. We worked and traveled, and I met some really lovely people, and it was great. But I was so tired, and so we came home after 6 months instead of the year we had planned. I started my applications to grad school for my Master's of Divinity, continuing my study of religion in the hopes of becoming a hospital chaplain. And I completed 1 year of a 3-year program before I got too sick. My fatigue was so bad I was struggling to do things like cook or shower or even walk. The brain fog was so intense I was struggling to read my assigned work for school. Quitting school really felt like failing, but I needed the time to try and rest as much as possible and go to doctor's appointments. It took a year of seeing doctors who were totally stumped by my symptoms, and doing tests that all came back normal despite how horrible I felt, to finally get to a specialist who diagnosed me with chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME/CFS. By then, COVID had hit, So it was much harder to get appointments. I got really lucky. I started on a medication regimen and started to feel better than I had in many years. I learned that I most likely contracted my disease from having the swine flu, H1N1, in 2010 when I was 16. If you have symptoms of long COVID for more than 6 months, you qualify for a diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome. So it's essentially the same disease, I just got it from a different virus. They're both post-viral infections. It's not known whether the body is hanging on to the virus or if the virus leaves something behind. Scientists are still figuring that out. But as I started to feel better, I wanted to write about what I had experienced. So I applied for a different grad school program, this time a MFA in creative nonfiction writing. I started writing a memoir about my experiences with chronic fatigue syndrome as part of my MFA program. I had an incredible advisor who really saw the value in my story and taught me a lot about writing vulnerably and honestly. But still, I was really struggling to write about something that I had so recently experienced. My writing sounded really like robotic and distant, which was the exact opposite of what I wanted, of course. I wanted it to be very raw and real, and that just wasn't coming across. I got really discouraged with the project, but I showed my advisor one of my old short stories from college, and he suggested that I might want to switch my MFA project to fiction to find a more authentic voice. But my husband and I were wanting to start a family, and I was getting really discouraged with my memoir project, so I ended up leaving my grad program after just one semester. I started working at my local library. I met some really amazing people there. After quite a long fertility journey, my husband and I got pregnant with a baby girl in 2023, and I left my library job to have her in the spring of 2024. Being surrounded by books at the library, you would think that I would have been reading a lot, but honestly, it was hard to want to read after working in that environment all day. I read a few books about parenting while I was pregnant with my daughter, but my reading had been in a slump for a while, and my writing for even longer. The newborn period was really hard on me and my husband, of course. Sleep deprivation, and it's just so much work. But after getting through that and having more time during my daughter's naps, I started wanting to read again. Natalie Goldberg has always been one of my favorite writing teachers, like I said earlier. And I saw that she had a new book called Writing on Empty about how to start writing again after a difficult time. I read it honestly not expecting to get very much out of it because I had been in a writing slump for so long. I just assumed it wouldn't work for me. I didn't think anything could pull me out of that. But this book did a lot to inspire me to start writing again. My daughter also inspired me to want to be the best mom and person I could be for her, because being creative and writing is one way that I can be my best self. So I started working on what would become my current novel project. My grad school advisor's advice had really stuck with me, and I wanted to try writing a fictionalized version of my story with MECFS. It was, and it still is, really important to me to tell that story. It's not about telling it for my own gain. It's about raising awareness for my disease and those who are still suffering from it, especially those who don't have access to the treatment that helped me so much, or people for whom that treatment didn't work. Eventually, I came up with the idea to put this character struggling with this disease in a post-apocalyptic setting. I want to explore kind of ideas of contribution and productivity and what it means to be a member of a society in that context. Slowly, over the course of the last year, as I started over about 1,000,000 times because I'm a perfectionist, and I wanted to get it exactly right, it evolved into what Project Hopepunk is today. Hopepunk is a subgenre defined by fantasy author Alexandra Rowland on Tumblr in 2017. They proposed Hopepunk as an alternative to grimdark, another subgenre in the dystopian sort of space that emphasizes a lack of moral values, usually including a lot of violence. Alexandra Rowland wrote in an essay online, and I'm just reading it off of my computer. The essence of grimdark is that everyone's inherently sort of a bad person and does bad things, and that's awful and disheartening and cynical. It's looking at human nature and going, the glass is half empty. Hopepunk says, no, I don't accept that. Go fuck yourself. The glass is half full. Yeah, we're all a messy mix of good and bad, flaws and virtues. We've all been mean and petty and cruel, but, and here's the important part, we've also been soft and forgiving and kind. Hopepunk says that kindness and softness don't equal weakness, and that in this world of brutal cynicism and nihilism, being kind is a political act, an act of rebellion. This perfectly describes what I want to do with this project, so I started calling it Project Hopepunk. I'm still very early on in the story. I have about 5,000 words at the moment, and I don't want to go into too many plot or character details, but with my story, I want to explore themes of disability, worthiness, meaning, and purpose. And I want to show how difficult it is for chronically ill and disabled people to navigate an ableist society, but also how beautiful our lives can still be as long as we can access the support that we need. I also want to explore family and found family, as well as queer relationships and a queer interabled relationship. An interabled relationship is a relationship where one partner has a disability and the other partner doesn't. This is the first novel that I'm attempting to write as an adult, so I feel wildly unprepared, but I'm excited to give it my best shot. I have a couple of writing groups that I'm in that really inspire me to keep going. The AuthorTube community here has really inspired me to want to keep going. It's inspired me to work towards my goals and really figure out what I want to say with my story. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble, and I hope you got something out of it. And I'll see you next time. Bye.